All right. Good morning, and welcome to the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce Annual General Meeting. My name is Adam Smith, President and CEO of My IT Guy, and Chair of the Board of Directors for the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on the foundation and mutual understanding and respect. As participants in today's virtual event, we are coming together as one. We believe everyone is free to be their true self and receive the same respect and opportunities, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, culture, identity, sexual orientation, beliefs, or language. We hope you'll join us in fostering a positive environment here today to ensure a safe and welcoming space for all. I would like to thank our sponsors who helped us make today possible. First of all, thanks to our event sponsors, Cowan Insurance Group, EY, Home Hardware Stores Limited, MCAT, University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and our speaker sponsor, Scotiabank. Today's annual general meeting will begin with the formal business meeting, followed by a presentation from our speaker, Jean-Francois Perot, Chief Economist with Scotiabank. There will be a short Q&A session following Jean-Francois' presentation before we finish with a networking opportunity in smaller breakout rooms to conclude today's event. Please ensure that your microphone is muted throughout today's business meeting and speaker presentation so we can reduce any background noise. If you have any questions that come up throughout the meeting, you can type them into the chat box in your control panel at any time. You can access that area by clicking chat at the bottom of your screen. If you are a voting member for today's meeting, we ask that you please participate in the voting poll that will pop up on your screen at the appropriate time during the meeting. The poll will stay open for about 10 seconds, allowing you time to vote before the motion is passed. If you accept the motion, please choose in favor in the poll. To oppose the motion, please choose opposed. Now, let's move forward with the business meeting portion of today's session. Notice to members having been properly given and seeing that we have in attendance sufficient members for quorum, the meeting is properly constituted to conduct business. I would like to ask for a call for a motion for approval of the 2020 annual general meeting minutes.
I would move that the minutes of the annual general meeting held September 23rd, 2020 be adopted as circulated.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? And carried. Over the last year, we've made it through 2 more lockdowns, and we're finally seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. More and more people are getting vaccinated, making further lockdowns unlikely and keeping businesses open safely. The Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce has continued to do its part in advocating for our members and equipping them with the information and tools they need to be effective during during a tumultuous time. In April, our chamber partnered with the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce and Communitech to launch the incredibly successful Rapid Screening for Workplaces program, which provides a small and medium businesses of up to 150 people with free rapid screening kits and medical grade masks for their employees. And the COVID-19 Safe Ambassador program, introduced in June, is in partnership with the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce and the region of Waterloo to help businesses operate safely by providing education and one-on-one guidance to help small and medium-sized businesses in Waterloo region to minimize their COVID-19 risks. With the federal election on our doorstep, I'm sure you've all had a chance to attend last week's local candidate forums to hear from the candidates in your riding. And I'm sure you're excited as ever to cast your votes on Monday. Regardless of which federal party is ultimately elected, your chamber will continue to work closely with all levels of government and advocate for policies and initiatives that best serve our members. Of course, none of these efforts happen on their own, so I would like to thank and recognize all of the volunteers who devote their time and energy to our myriad committees, the entire Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce staff for their dedication and creativity, and President and CEO Ian Mclean, who has consistently kept everyone asking, what can we do today to best help our members? All of these efforts have aided innumerable local businesses through an incredibly challenging period, and we are as eager as ever to welcome all of our members back to our in-person events as it becomes safe and comfortable for us all to do so. We will now hear from Scott Gilfillan to report on financial results.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Scott Gilfillan. I'm a partner with PwC here in Waterloo and our Waterloo market leader. And I'm pleased as the treasurer for the Greater KW Chamber of Commerce to present the financial results. Included in your package and in the chat box was provided a set of the audited financial statements for the Greater KW Chamber of Commerce for the year ended June 30th, 2021. Included in those audited financial statements was the auditor's report. So I'm happy to report that RLB LLP, our auditors, provided us with a clean audit opinion dated August 24th, 2021. Just a couple quick highlights I wanted to mention of the financial results. The financial position of the chamber is very strong at the end of the year at June 30, with a strong cash position and other assets well in excess of our liabilities. Flipping ahead to the statement of operations, really that's been driven by a couple of things. Continued support from our members through membership fees and events, and also support from the government in the form of wage subsidy grant, which has allowed us to end the year with a surplus. Part of that surplus has been earmarked to use in the next year for a number of initiatives to continue to invest in our chamber and its members. So happy to report very strong financial position, strong year despite the pandemic. Our chamber management and staff have done a great job in continuing with our events and publications as much as we can through the pandemic, and that's shown in our results. And of course, the wage subsidy has helped us to maintain our employees and keep offering the services that our members need. Back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Scott. Can I have a call for a motion? Sorry, can I have a motion approving the financial statements?
On the recommendation of the Board of Directors, I move that the financial statements for the year ended June 30, 2021, as audited by the firm RLB LLP be approved.
I second the motion.
All right. Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? And it looks like that is carried. I would like to call for a motion appointing auditors for the 2021-2022 fiscal year.
The Board of Directors recommends that RLB LLP be appointed auditors for the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce for the 2021-2022 fiscal year.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Carried. I would like to call for a motion for ratification of chamber business.
I would move that resolutions, minutes, contracts, appointments, and payments, acts and proceedings of the Board of Directors and officials of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce up to the present time be hereby ratified and approved, and said directors and officials released from all liability herewith.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? And carried. I'd like to call for a report from Alison Burke, reporting on behalf of the nominating committee.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alison Burke. I'm the owner of Oxford Learning Waterloo. The chamber bylaws provide that the chamber be managed by a board consisting of not less than 11 and not more than 22 directors. A nominating committee appointed by the board recommended 3 candidates for the available position on the board, one of whom elected to withdraw their nomination. The call for independent nominations for the 2021-2022 Board of Directors closed on June 15th, 2021, with no additional nominees. As such, an election is not required. Andrea Verbanovic, as the board secretary, can you confirm that in accordance with our bylaws, a slate of candidates was set by the nominating committee and notice sent to the chamber voting delegates representing our member firms in good standing that an election is not required?
I so confirm.
I'd like to call for a motion for appointment of Gina Hudel from Sun Life Financial and Ajoa Minta from For All Ice Cream to the Board of Directors for a 2-year term.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? And carried.
I'd like to call for a motion for the appointment of Wendy Campbell, the Food Bank of Waterloo Region, Brad Dunbar, Getz and Dunbar Professional Corporation, Richard Jacques, BMO Financial Group, Scott Gilfillan, PwC, Chris Ronan, Ronan Consulting, Sean Sullivan, Gowling WLG, for an additional 2-year term. These individuals are currently at the end of their 2-year term and will be appointed for another 2-year term.
I would move that Wendy Campbell, Brad Dunbar, Richard Jacques, Scott Gilfillan, Chris Ronan, and Sean Sullivan be appointed for a 2-year term commencing the 2021-2022 fiscal year.
Second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, carried. As such, I am pleased to announce that the following individuals form the 2021-2022 Board of Directors for the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Adam Smith, Maya Guy, Alison Burke, Oxford Learning Centre, Ajoa Minta, For All Ice Cream, Brad Dunbar, Getz and Dunbar Professional Corporation, Carlene Carroll, Wilfrid Laurier University, Gina Hudel, Sun Life Financial, Glenn Thorpe, Flight Path, Chris Ronan, Ronan Consulting, Nick Hefner, Hefner Lexus Toyota, Richard Jacques, BMO Financial Group, Scott Gilfillan, PwC, Sean Sullivan, Gowling WLG, Shelley Forwell, Walter Fady, and Wendy Campbell at the Food Bank of Waterloo Region.
I'd like to introduce City of Waterloo's Mayor, Dave Jaworski, to perform the official induction of the Board of Directors.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. And as many of you can see, I've now become the founder of the Adam Smith Fan Club, thanks to a fundraising event for Terry Fox, a head shaving event the other day. And the Terry Fox run is this Sunday, just as an FYI. Special thank you to Ian Mclean and the team at the Chamber of Commerce for your exemplary work of the continuous information that even I use as my cornerstone of information on the pandemic and recovery and business aspects. Just a huge shout out to the team there, Ian. You got a wonderful group. Thanks to your leadership, probably even. So the good news is for all the directors, you simply have to say, I do, once I finish reading the oath. I swear I will faithfully and truly perform my duty as a board member of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce, that I will, in all matters connected with the discharge of such duty, do all things as I shall truly and conscientiously believe to be adapted to promote the objects for which the said chamber was constituted, according to the true intent and meaning of the same. So help me God.
I do.
You may now proceed, Ian Mclean.
And everyone's welcome to the Adam Haircut Club. We're very welcoming group. So nice to have you join us. I would like to thank the Chamber's corporate partners for their support over the past year, all of whom are listed in the Chamber's annual report. Our corporate partners from the Chamber Chair Circle, BDO, BlackBerry, BMO, Cowan Insurance Group, Enbridge, Equitable Life of Canada, EY, GHD, Google, Gowling WLG Canada LLP, Hefner Lexus Hefner Toyota, Home Hardware, Huawei, Immigration Partnership, Manulife, MCAP, McCarter Graspan, Meridian, MNP, SG Cunningham Limited, Sun Life, University of Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier University. Our chamber patron sponsors, BDC, Cushman & Wakefield Waterloo Region, PwC, Raffy Jewelers, and TD. Our title sponsors are J Fencing Business Round 5, Manulife Business Success Series, Libro Credit Union Chamber Young Professionals, MNP Networking Breakfast Series, and Hefner Women's Leadership. Our chamber trustees would be Activa, Bell, Conestoga Meatpackers, KPMG, MTE, Walter Fady, and Waterloo EDC. Our media partners, 570 News, 96.7 Chime FM, Country 106.7, CTV, and Waterloo Region Record. Our physician recruitment sponsors. A thank you to all of our physician recruitment sponsors for the continued support of the Chamber's healthcare initiatives. These sponsors are crucial to the success of the Chamber's Healthcare Resource Council's annual Family Medicine Resident Weekend. Going into its 23rd year, this event is instrumental in residents' decisions to establish their family practice here in the region. Our Chamber prospers thanks to the help of our many committed and passionate volunteers who devote their time and energy on committees and during events. I would like to extend a sincere thank you to each and every one of you. This year, we have one retiring committee chair. Having volunteered on the Chamber Young Professionals Committee for a number of years, he helped spark excitement and creativity when events committees like this needed it most. Thank you, Mohsen Abdullah. We also say farewell to two retiring directors. Over the past 4 years, Andrea Verbenek has graciously shared her wealth of HR knowledge with the board and our exec committee, and Kelly McManus, who has diligently served our board for 8 years, reliably guiding us through some particularly challenging times. I've learned a lot from each of you. Your insights, guidance, and presence will be missed. Thank you for all you've given. Retiring members are welcome to volunteer in the future, and the Chamber staff will do their best to accommodate their specific interests. We will now hold a short meeting of the Board of Directors to appoint the Executive Committee for 2021-2022. As this portion of the meeting is of the Board of Directors, only board members need to pass the motion. As such, there will be no polls that appear on screen for these motions. Acknowledging that we have a quorum of directors present, the board meeting is properly constituted to conduct business. In accordance with our bylaws, the Board of Directors recommends the appointment of the members of the Exec Committee for a one-year term. Could I please have a call for a motion?
I move that the appointed officers for a one-year term on the 2021-2022 Executive Committee be Adam Smith, Chair, Scott Gilfillan, Chair-elect and Treasurer, Wendy Campbell, Vice Chair, and Gina Hudell, Secretary.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? And carried. Can I get a call for a motion to adjourn the board meeting?
I would move that all business having been conducted, the board meeting is adjourned.
I second the motion.
Any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I am pleased to announce the following individuals formed the 2021-2022 Executive Committee for the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Adam Smith as Chair, Scott Gilfillan as Chair-elect and Treasurer, Wendy Campbell as Vice Chair, and Gina Hudell as Secretary. If there is no further business, I call for a motion adjourning the annual general meeting.
I would move that all business having been conducted, the annual general meeting is adjourned.
I second the motion.
I would like to once again thank our sponsors for today's event. Our event sponsors, Cal Insurance Group, EY, Home Hardware Stores Limited, MCAP, University of Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier University, and our speaker sponsor, Scotiabank. Thank you for your continued support. We are also excited to announce that we are now accepting nominations for the 2022 Business Excellence Awards Gala that will be held on Thursday, February 10th, 2022. To nominate a local business, please visit greaterkwchamber.com. Nominations will be accepted until Friday, October 22nd, 2021. I will now turn it over to our Chamber's President and CEO, Ian Mclean.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to the Board of Directors for your support and guidance throughout the past year, and your support of our members as well. It has absolutely been a challenging last 12 months or 18 months, actually. So the support for my team in particular and our Chamber administration has been very much appreciated. It has been a tough time for so many of our members and businesses having to alter their business operations with every lockdown, try to plan for a future as we start to experience some normalcy again. But we're not through this yet. And I guess one of the challenges that we have is how do we support our members? Because it's an uneven return to business. And as we open up, some sectors are doing better than others. And we at the Chamber, ourselves, we have 18 staff. We're experiencing some of those same challenges ourselves, such as when to open up, how to keep safe. But we're working diligently to advocate for our members with all levels of government, and providing our members and frankly the business community as a whole with the tools and resources they need to reopen and recover. Because what we know is reopening isn't the same as recovery, and it doesn't mean that you're fully up and running again. There's going to be some challenges depending on your business sector about what opening means and how we get there. So we still have quite a ways to go, but I'm optimistic about the upcoming year. I want to thank everyone for attending today's event and for supporting the Chamber of Commerce and the staff over the last 18 months, but as we move forward. We're always here for our members, and I would take this moment to give just a little bit of a public service announcement, as we always do. There are lots of tools that are free of charge for any member of the Chamber of Commerce, as well as any business, frankly, in Waterloo region. If you go to chambercheck.ca, that's a website and a resource that we manage, coordinate collectively with the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce, where you can get free medical grade masks, free COVID rapid screening kits, free training, ambassador visits, so that you can keep yourself, your customers, and your employees safe as we reopen. So thank you for your ongoing support. At this time, I'd also like to thank our today's speaker sponsor. I'm very, very pleased to have Scotiabank join us today to have a good discussion with JF Perot on the challenges and the opportunities moving forward over the next year. So I'm excited to have to introduce James Damon, District Vice President, Waterloo Region District, who's with Scotiabank. James and I are going to meet for the first time in about a moment online, and I'll look forward to connecting with him in the coming days. James was born and raised in Kitchener, knows our market well, and still resides here with his wife, Joanne, who's a teacher with the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. They have two kids, Josh, who's attending Conestoga College, and Jess, who's attending Huron Heights High School. Prior to joining Scotia, James held various positions across Southwestern Ontario through his 25-year career at TD Bank. He joined Scotia in April of 2019 as District Vice President in Southwestern Ontario, and is excited to lead the Scotiabank team with 14 branches throughout Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. He officially assumes the role here in the region in a couple of weeks, but we're fortunate here to have him today to introduce today's speaker. So please join me in welcoming James Damon.
Ian, awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that introduction. I want to let everyone know that Scotiabank is a proud partner of today's event, and I'm happy to be able to virtually join you here all today. So thank you. I'm very excited to be back in Waterloo region with Scotiabank. I've watched the region grow over the years and know it's one of the largest and fastest growing regions in Ontario. We know that every business has a different path, and I can assure you that Scotiabank is here to support and advise you on that journey. I now have the privilege of introducing today's speaker. Jean-Francois Perot joined Scotiabank as the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist in 2015. He leads a team of economists to support Scotiabank's domestic and international business lines and clients from retail to capital markets, providing Scotiabank senior executives, business lines, and customers with perspectives, insights, and forecasts on economic, financial market, and policy developments. Prior to joining Scotiabank, Jean-Francois held prominent roles with the federal government, the Bank of Canada, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Please join me in welcoming Jean-Francois Perot, who will be joined by Ian Mclean for a fireside chat.
Well, thanks, James, and JF. I really appreciate you taking the time. We enjoyed we took some time to do some prep for this, and really enjoyed our conversation with Sean Goddard. So thank you for. I think you're at an undisclosed location somewhere in Ottawa or Toronto region today.
That's right. I'm not in Waterloo. That's right.
No, you're in Waterloo. Okay, good. So we like all of us, many of us are working from home still. Listen, we've got a series of questions we'll go through. I'm going to try and keep track of the chat box in case there are some questions that come in from the floor, but we've got a series of those to get through. But let me start today's paper. The national or the Globe and Mail, inflation hits 18-year high fueled by pandemic factors. The National Post, there's a cost of living crisis, housing prices going up by 14.3%, biggest increase in 34 years. I guess it leads to, and this has been part of the election campaign, it really does talk about inflation, the cost of doing business, both for individuals and business. What's your sense of when we see those headlines? What should business owners in Canada make of that?
It's well, the one thing that is perhaps of biggest importance is to understand that it's not a Canadian specific thing, that the challenges that we're dealing with on the inflation front really reflect a broader challenge, that global growth is just way stronger than we thought it was going to be a year, 18 months ago. And as a result of that, you've got demand pressures that are such that the supply system, so the production chains, the supply chains, the commodity producers are having a hard time keeping up with that. So it's generating inflation across a range of countries, but it's happening essentially because growth is strong, and we're just not able to keep up on the production side. So that's it's comforting in the sense that it's not bad inflation in the sense that it's happening and everything is terrible and we're just getting this supply shock that's raising prices when nobody can make any money. It's quite the opposite, that prices are rising because simply we're not able to keep up from a kind of business perspective. So what it means from a business perspective is really that we're dealing with, obviously, a range of supply challenges, and I'm sure almost every one of your members has experienced a supply challenge in one dimension or another. But those supply challenges really reflect the fact that business is good, and it's difficult to keep up with demand. It's difficult to take advantage of some of the opportunities because you're looking at the environment and worried about that. So that's where the inflation is coming from. Now, the expectation, the hope is that that's reasonably temporary, that production will eventually meet up with demand, and when that happens, there'll be this kind of better balance between supply and demand, and prices will start to moderate, or the price growth will start to moderate. Now, that's been the story for a number of quarters. It's been the Bank of Canada story for a number of months as well. But quite honestly, like the further we get into this recovery, the more prices are kind of sticky on the upside. So the more these supply challenges seem to bite. And what we're observing now is that maybe this notion or this hope that what we're seeing on the price side was going to be temporary, was going to fade at some point in time. Well, the more evidence we get that prices are going in kind of the up direction, the harder it becomes to credibly say, listen, we're really confident this is temporary, and that price growth will return to like a normal level in 6 months.
So for some of us are old enough to remember like the early 80s when inflation and interest rates were, it was really quite bad. I mean, this is more ephemeral. It may be it may go up somewhat, but it's not like it's out of control and it's going to likely stay up. There's an ephemeral nature to that because of supply chain issues, et cetera, that are driving, and as things reopen, people are taking a while to get their stock up and running.
Yeah, so I mean that's certainly our expectation. And when you look at developments on the commodity market side, which are perhaps kind of the most day-to-day supply chain indicators, you've seen, for instance, the price of lumber, which was like skyrocketing in the earlier part of the year. Production ramped up a lot, and those prices have come down a lot. And that's happened in a number of commodity spaces. Other commodities are feeling pressure now. So the supply challenges are shifting from one area to the other. But I mean, there is good reason to believe that what we're experiencing is temporary. And even if it were a little bit more persistent, I mean, this is not a throwback to the 80s, right? I mean, interest rates in Canada are like they're record lows. Bond rates are like, 10, you can borrow 10 years in the government bond market for like less than a percentage point and a half. And that means that if we do have an inflation problem, God forbid, in a year, 6 months, 18 months, there's plenty of space for the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates without bringing the rates back up to 18, 19, 20%, which is what happened, 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
So that's, we're not really worried about it. What it means is at the margin, if you're a market player, then maybe rates go up a little bit more rapidly if inflation is a little bit stronger, but it's not, we end up with rates that are at 6% in a year or two. That is not going to happen for sure.
Okay, so as an economist, you're in the business of predictions, or at least taking good information and at least forecasting, if you want to call it that. The election results that come next week. So I'm not asking you to predict what's going to happen, but each of the parties has clearly, various different policies depending on who wins or what's the makeup of the parliament and what policies end up coming through parliament. Do you think there's any major change? Not necessarily well, let's start with national economic forecast. I mean, you're talking about what the range of how much economic growth is going to be. What does that mean for employment? What does it mean for wages and those sorts of things? Do you think the election result, as what you see right now, is really going to impact any of those national economic forecasts in the short term?
Not at all. Not at all. And this is a pretty unusual situation. And I say not at all, because when you look at the platform, so when we think about platforms and their impact on economic activity, what we by and large look at in the short run is, what are government spending plans? Are they vastly different from one platform to another? Now, sure, composition matters. If you do this type of spending over that type of spending, that matters at the margin. But, for the next 12, 18 months, it's basically what's the amount of firepower that's being thrown at the economy from the federal perspective. And in previous elections, you had a really big difference between, say, what the Conservatives were going to do on the budget side versus what the Liberals and the NDP and the other parties, I guess, if you wanted to talk about those. But so, it would have been fair to say, go back to 2015 or 2019, if the Conservatives win over the Liberals, we would foresee a different set of economic outcomes in, say, the next 12 months. That's not the case now. I mean, the platforms from a spending perspective, deficit perspective, they're basically identical. And they're identical for the next 3-4 years. Now, the Liberals and the Conservatives say that's not true. But really, when you look at the numbers, the magnitudes, there isn't very much difference. So given that, it's a pretty safe bet to say, from a macro perspective, from a forecasting perspective, it's largely a non-event. Whether it's a liberal minority, a conservative minority, we're kind of in the same ballpark. And that's comforting in some sense. Perhaps not comforting if you're, partisan one way or the other, because it's not really the kind of message you want to hear, that your platform isn't all that different from somebody else's. But that's kind of what we think. So markets aren't really looking at the election and worrying about it. None of our clients are really worried about it, like on the capital market side. It's just, it's an election for the sake of having an election that really is not going to change a whole lot.
Now, there are some, and we don't quite know what the impact would be on some of the bigger policies. So, but I think what I hear you saying in the short term, depending on what your climate, conservatives climate plan versus liberals climate plan versus a minority where it may be more aggressive if it was a, left of center coalition of sorts, that could change. But do I hear you saying that even if you're moving on some of those climate plans as an example, which seem to have more impact on government, on taxes, on spending programs, that's still around the margins in the short term?
In the short term, yeah. And obviously, when you go farther out, it's a bigger issue, right? The Conservatives have, for instance, on the green plan, have a carbon price that is dramatically lower than the Liberals would have. So as you push that out further, these differences start to accumulate into something. Now, they're not necessarily better or worse in terms of economic outcomes. It's just there will be an adaptation on the part of the economy. I mean, just look at, banks, for instance, are a good example. In the short run, if the Liberals win, there's going to be a bank tax and some special dividends imposed on us, which, will actually be quite costly. It's not kind of macroeconomically significant, probably, but it will impact the financial sector. Right.
Okay, so as we look at, as a sector that we talk a reasonable amount here in Ontario, and especially Southwestern Ontario, is the energy sector. There's a lot of jobs that are impacted directly, especially in the manufacturing space that support are a part of the supply chain in the energy sector. And frankly, the oil and gas in particular sector are going to be a big part of our economy for years to come, whether anyone likes it or not. Yeah. So there's a direct impact here in terms of the cost of doing business, the environmental piece, and how quickly we do some transition. I guess the question is, again, on platforms, if you accept that those are something that might actually get put in place by whoever wins, is there what do you forecast for the energy sector, because it is so important to the Canadian economy as a whole, and I would say specifically here in Southwestern Ontario, it's not just the energy supply, it's the jobs that are created and support across Western Canada. What's your sense of that, because you're trying to wrap together environmental, jobs, sort of the energy piece that business needs, that drives business?
Yeah, it's very clear that the Conservatives are far more business minded when it comes to the energy, the carbon-based energy system, right? So we talked about the carbon tax, which will be lower under them, but it goes to pipeline issues, it goes to investment, it goes to how welcoming the government is going to be to those sectors. Now, Liberals have a bit of a perspective, not that they are. The energy folks who say Liberals are very much going for them, and there's some truth to that. But the Liberals also understand that the carbon-based economy is still a very important part of the Canadian economy. So they're not going to try. I can't imagine they're going to try and slash and burn in the short run. So again, in the short run, it's not clear that there's a huge difference, but very certainly the way we think about it, the Conservative outcome is probably much more favorable to the carbon-based energy sector over the longer run than the Liberals will be. Now, that being said, there's a limit, I think, to how how politicians can influence outcomes in the sector. And what we've seen, for instance, over the last, actually we've seen it pretty aggressively this year in the last 18 months or so, is that the market is playing an increasingly important role in driving some of these outcomes, right? And they're driving outcomes in a way that makes it a little bit more challenging for the oil and gas industry, right? These are, these ESG considerations and activist investment funds that, shun certain types of investments, shun certain types of exposures. And that kind of financial dynamic is having a real impact on a range of industries. It's not just oil and gas, there are other industries affected as well. So that's irrespective of the political situation and whether one government is more welcoming of future oil and gas development. There is also this other kind of overlay that is problematic and challenging.
Is the I guess the other part of that is, does the sector itself, there are some that they are pushing forward. We see this in the States, and I think to some degree in Canada, which are saying, political fights notwithstanding, we know we have to move because they see what the future is. So you talk about the market, which is money's moving around and saying who are the winners and losers, who's betting on who to create wealth and create opportunity for investors. But the businesses themselves, the oil and gas companies, are trying to figure out what their next step is. How do they reinvent themselves into the green economy or green energy? Is that, do you see that being, will that help drive or speed things regardless of the policy that
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the writing is on the wall to a certain extent, right? I mean, we may have our kind of political priorities here, but you've got countries like the US and like the UK and other countries that are, basically saying that as of a certain point in time, no more gas powered cars will be allowed and these kinds of things, right? So like there's clearly a direction to this, and companies know this, and they're adapting and they're investing and they are, they're doing the right things to anticipate those things and position themselves for that. So, it's not something that's happening overnight. They've got, depending on which country you're talking about, 20, 30 years, 10, 20 or 30 years. But it is what's happening in that space is clearly, there clearly is a tremendous amount of innovation taking place, a lot of really interesting investments, a lot of really interesting research that is going to help them and help us kind of manage the next, the green transition. And in that space, regardless of the government that I think is in power, we're going to see tremendous amount of government support, right? Like all parties in Canada know that this is the direction of the future, and that we need to support that and foster that as much as we possibly can. Now, maybe one government will be more supportive of another, but we're talking about something that, like, the train is moving, and it's just a matter of how much. Well, I'm not going to say coal you give it to, but how much hydropower you can power it with.
Okay, we've seen here, and we talked about this in getting ready for this. I guess with respect to housing, housing prices have gone up, particularly during the pandemic. And it's a bigger question than just affordability of housing for people getting into the market. We have our friends at the Waterloo Region Home Builders Association and others that are trying to build the mix of our friends at Activa and others that are trying to build homes, and what's the right mix, and home ownership is a huge public policy for most parties is how to do that. But increasingly we're seeing affordability and accessibility in the rental market, because that's a huge part, especially for young people, newcomers to our country that are going to drive the talent and other things. So immigrants and newcomers to our country. And here in the region of Waterloo, I guess when we look at it here, we know Toronto's supercharged, and you hear the stories of Vancouver, but Waterloo region, there's been a spillover where you've had bidding wars for existing homes. What's your outlook nationally? I mean, if we gotta go nationally, what do you see in terms of housing and how we're going to deal with that here in Ontario? And then when you get to that sub-regional, the Southwestern Ontario Waterloo region, I think everyone's interested in was that huge shock in prices. Again, was it ephemeral, or is it going to stabilize? It seems to have, but what's your sense from Scotiabank's perspective on those as we group those issues together?
So folks' perspective on whether this is a good or bad thing depends, I think, on whether you're a homeowner or not. If you're a homeowner, obviously last year has been fantastic, and almost certainly, the next many years are going to be good as well. Not in the sense that the house price growth that we're seeing is going to continue at current paces. I mean, house price in Waterloo up 30% year over year. That's clearly unsustainable. And at national level, it's 14%. Other markets, it depends on where you're at. But whether you're in Waterloo, whether you're in Ontario, whether you're in, looking at it from a national perspective, there are basically two things that are driving the housing market. And the most important thing, and this is something that existed pre-pandemic, was simply that population growth in Canada had been so fast that the housing supply had not kept up. So this is not a matter of, number of homes for sale or, homeowners versus renters. It's simply, it's kind of a basic math problem. We've increased population a lot through immigration, which has had tremendous benefits for the Canadian economy, tremendous benefits for your part of the country as well. And we weren't thoughtful enough to think, well, actually, if we're going to bring in 400,000 people a year, we're going to need places for those. So as a result of that, you've had this pressure building, and that pressure is essentially, was turbocharged through the pandemic because government supports are really generous to a lot of people. Interest rates were slashed. And then you had on top of that, which affected, again, areas around GTA perhaps more than others actually in the country, you had, COVID related working from home and folks wanting bigger properties and not having to, commute into work anymore. So you had folks leave the big cities to go to outlying areas. So that created a tremendous amount of pressure in places like Kitchener-Waterloo and others around like St. John, New Brunswick. And I mean, this was like people are going far away from where they used to be. And that's obviously a bit of a temporary thing. So the interest rate thing is a bit of a temporary thing. People kind of changing their housing preferences and moving outside of the city. That's a bit of a temporary thing. What's not temporary is that we're still not building enough. And that's happening in an environment where we haven't even seen, in fact, over the last year or so, we've kind of been fortunate from a housing perspective because immigration was shut down, closed our borders. So we didn't have that additional influx. Governments, both parties are committed to increasing that going forward. So the Conservatives basically said we buy into the Liberal plan, which is for, roughly 400, a little more 400,000 folks a year for the next 3-4 years. So when you think of it from that perspective, demand is going to rise, not necessarily because interest rates are low, but just because we got more people in the country.
Yeah.
And supply is not proven itself not to be able to keep up. So when we put it all together, we don't think house prices are going to continue to rise by crazy rates, but we don't think they're going to come down. And so the gains are more or less locked in. And that's true whether it's at your level, whether it's at the Ontario level, it's whether at the national level. We're kind of on this path where it's very, very difficult to see how affordability is restored in a meaningful way, because that requires a reduction in house prices.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't seem to be in the cards.
And I mean, it does have a carry on. If you got a hot housing market, you generally have a hot ICI market, industrial, commercial, and supply.
And you're
So
100% seeing that, right?
You're seeing that here, where just getting employment space is also going up. Maybe you're a lot younger than I am, notwithstanding my gray beard and yours.
I'm not sure about that.
But I don't ever recall. I think all of the parties have a version of a housing policy that they put front and center, not something that was buried on page 99 of their to say they were talking about affordable housing or some. These are, I think, in that context of the first question of saying inflation's here, people are feeling the pressure of added cost to their own
Number
house.
one issue. Yeah.
Number one issue, affordability. I think everyone's talking about it. I don't ever recall all the parties making it front and center, like one of the top 3 issues of, and not just affordability, but specifically on housing and what they're going to do to address what you just talked about, which is either the demand side or, well, primarily the supply side. Not actually judging between the plans, but at least are they having the right conversation about how to solve the problem that you just identified for us?
Well, it's great that it's on the radar to the extent that it is. But the problem is there isn't a whole lot the federal government can do, right? So the stuff that all the parties are talking about affordability, as you said, and it's stuff like, we're going to make it easier to save for down payment. We're going to make it easier to tap savings. We're going to make it like mortgage insurance cheaper, a range of things that basically we know will increase demand, right? If you're trying to make it easier to buy a place, and obviously it's because most people are going to buy a place, right? So those measures, the federal government can do something about those, and it looks like everybody's kind of agreed. I mean, there's variations in terms of what they're going to do, but they've all got their eyes on that. They're also talking about, building more homes. So the Conservatives want to build 1 million more places. The Liberals want to one-up them and build 1.4 million over 3 years. Those promises are much more difficult to put in place, because at the end of the day, the blockage on the supply side, it's not at the federal level. It's to some extent at the provincial, mostly at the municipal.
Yeah, municipal.
So, what you've seen out of the Liberals and the Conservatives is, well, we're gonna give more money. Well, Liberals are basically saying we're gonna give more money to the regions that accelerate certain things as a reward to increase, the speed of development and zoning, all that kind of stuff. The Conservatives are more in the punitive space of, well, if you don't do this, we're gonna withhold transit funding. I'm I kind of think that option is probably more effective in stimulating change than the reward. But they're both, but they both understand that there's a limit to what the federal government can do. So when you look at the platforms, you have measures that 100% with 100% certainty are going to raise demand, no question. With the flip side of that, with measures that might possibly affect supply. So when we look at it, we're like, well, this isn't going to change the game. If anything, it might make things a little bit worse, because we know that every attempt to encourage municipalities to accelerate the speed of development just doesn't really do anything, right? So that's where an organization like yours can be really helpful, right? Is because there is a tremendous amount to be gained here. If you as a region are able to figure out how to accelerate development, how to kind of greenify your development process, there is a potential there to be really kind of big movers and shakers in terms of being able to attract people, because it's just a really slow going process in most places, like every place.
Okay, I will come back to that, because I think the whole question of talent, which was what you really got
It's
at.
totally linked to that, yeah.
It's totally linked to, do we have enough in the trades and to do the building, to do the ICI work, let alone in manufacturing and hospitality tourism. But I want to do I intentionally didn't start with COVID, not because it's not the topic of the day, but because I wanted to focus on some of what else is in the next year as it relates to the election. But I do want to take a couple of minutes or a couple of questions and talk a little bit about COVID and what this means, because we're not through this. And I think that's what our message to government is. Some sectors have been doing well. It's been more of an inconvenience for them, if I can characterize it that. Others, it's been devastating. So hospitality, tourism, restaurants, retail have really been devastating. So this is not over by a long shot for a lot of sectors who are still yet to fully open. In many cases, they're barely open. So a variety of experts, other banks, other financial experts have been talking about the impact, because I think this is where we're at now, with vaccine passports or vaccine verification as a tool that will really drive a region or a province's economic forecast. So I guess does Scotiabank believe that this issue will be something that if you don't have it and you have to close down, or you just don't have that same confidence, that will drive up or down economic activity in a province or a region? Because I think that's ultimately the question. When it comes down to this, it's not philosophical for business. It's no one wants to do it, but the only thing that we have to take completely off the table is another general lockdown, because that will be absolutely devastating. What's your sense of that how that fits into how it will impact forecasts for the recovery that we hope to see for the balance of this year and into next?
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm being completely frank, we kind of anticipate that all provinces are going to do this, right? So it's not really a game changer in terms of the outlook, because it is perhaps not the only sensible thing you can do, but probably the best thing you can do to insulate the economy from this wave or whatever other future waves there might be. And in fact, the most ardent of recalcitrants, if you will, which have been Ford, who's obviously flipped on that a few weeks ago, and now Kenny in Alberta, who said, last night said, okay, well, we got to do it. And you can think of it in terms of the public health consequences, which is obviously probably positive. But for us, like, this was inevitable that provinces would do this, because it is really the only way, if you're serious about controlling the spread of the virus, the only way to put a fire break between what's happening on the virus side and what's happening on the economic side. So, in terms of our forecast, we're not really factoring in all, some negative impacts in one province or another, because we all assume that they were going to do it at some point in the fall, and they are doing that. So that's great. But that doesn't it doesn't mean that we're going back to normal like right away, as you said. I mean, there are industries that are still suffering mightily and will continue to suffer mightily until things are completely back to normal, which probably a few months, a couple of quarters away, depends on, again, the vaccination rates, depends on iterations of the virus. But we are very happy to see that governments are taking the hard but necessary step of saying, you know what, okay, we said we were going to do this, we're doing it because it's in everybody's best interest.
Yeah, and I think that's that's ultimately what it is. There's no business. I mean, the Ontario Chamber, the Canadian Chamber. I know you have discussions at those senior levels. Locally here with our best Waterloo, the Business Economic Support Team, which is the two chambers of commerce, Waterloo Economic Development, Communitech, and Explore Waterloo, which is hospitality and tourism. We all said, no one wants to do this, but boy, you better have it in place, because if your only other choice as schools reopen, we get into the fall.
Well, this is the thing, right?
Yeah, because a lockdown is not an acceptable answer, because we know that there are other tools, and this is one that, and maybe that, I don't know if you have this, if this is unfair, you can punt the question, but in other parts of the world, they've used this successfully to sort of dampen down those or to make sure that economic growth has not been stifled. This is not something we're creating here. This has actually been used other places in the world. Isn't that right?
Oh, for sure. But it was used, I will say that in places where it was used first, so France in particular, Italy to some extent, the Americans are like, some cities have got them, but it's not very widespread. But in those places where they rolled them out at first, it's not clear that it was done with, an eye, with the eye of kind of breaking the link between the economic world and the virus world, but rather as a means to propel vaccination rates forward. Because if you look at France, when they announced their passports and basically said, listen, you can't go into a restaurant unless you're vaccinated, they got like 1 million vaccination appointments like the next day or something, and it just really helped increase vaccination rates. We're at a different level here. I mean, we're the most vaccinated country in the world, advanced country in the world. So for us, it really is about, I guess, at the margin, encouraging people to take the vaccine. But it's kind of a proven approach, and we're not groundbreakers by any stretch of the imagination on this.
Yeah. So the technology's there to be able to do that. And I think you're right. I mean, we've always heard from Deputy Hilton, who's the chair of our vaccine task force here in town, and our public health folks. And I think this is the same everywhere across the country. It's that last 5% or 7% that you're going to need, because by all accounts, it's now closer to 90% double vax that you're going to need to kind of get to herd immunity, and hopefully by next spring or ish, that we're back to whatever that new normal is. So that's interesting, because I think it's important that this is, it's not just a public health thing. It actually has a benefit of driving vaccinations, which ultimately is how we reopen the economy fully. So let's turn a little bit to, and there's not much we can argue till the cows come home, or at least drill down on the federal and provincial government programs, and to some extent local government programs to support business through this. I think less about looking back than looking forward is, what's your assessment of how and who need the support, the continued support, as we start to reopen? And we hear this from our friends in the hospitality. I've got lots of friends and lots of members who have restaurants and in the hospitality space who say reopening does not equate to recovery. They're having talent issues of people saying, I'm not sure I want to go back into that business, because, especially this summer, if the sun's not shining and your patio's not open, your restaurant's not open. So how do you get talent when you could be, really, really part-time? So things like CERB, it's a flashpoint. Like, is it too much? Does that prevent people from going back into the workplace? But even things like wage subsidy, and the rent program for particularly those hard hit hospitality and tourism sectors. I mean, we're saying, don't exactly know what the answer is, other than shutting down those programs as a whole. For a manufacturer may not be the same as hospitality, tourism versus retail. I mean, Any thoughts on the timing and the sectors that are going to require that? If you make the argument that you still want to have a hospitality and tourism sector in the country, which I assume we do, it's a big part of our economy. What do you do to support that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any government is going to move on those programs until we're well clear of the pandemic. So, I mean, I know there's this October deadline for some of these things, and they've pushed that back every few months. But they're pushing it back because they know it, like they can't pull it away. And I, you know, as much as things are solid from a demand perspective now, and people want to buy stuff and they want to go out and they want to do a whole bunch of stuff, and it's difficult to get a reservation, it's difficult to get workers. You know, the Liberals or the Conservatives are going to be in a minority position, and they're not going to want to piss businesses off by doing this, right? I can't imagine that happens. So, as far as I'm concerned, you know, until it's going to take a lot more strength on the business side, particularly industries that are most affected, and before they start scaling these things back. And that's, you know, I think it's quarters away, not months away. Now there is a debate as to, for instance, on the CERB side, you know, why is it so difficult for firms in certain sectors to get workers to come back? And CERB probably plays a part of that, and there's some studies that suggest it might at the limit. But I think it's also largely, and there's solid evidence of this in the US, because we've got better data on the labor market side, that, for instance, in hospitality and food and accommodation, so the hospitality sector, 30% of those workers have changed industries. Like, they don't want to go back. So it's creating this real transition problem that, you know, there's demand is coming back, and you just can't get the people to do the types of jobs that needed to be done. Now, in principle, the reaction to that, I mean, the market, the economic reaction to that is, well, okay, you raise wages, and then people are eventually, at some point, you're going to pay enough, and people are going to go back. The challenge there is, well, firstly, that's not happening really. But second, I mean, there's a point at which firms, you know, and especially in low margin industries, you know, they just can't double salaries to get people back, right? So policies like the wage subsidy, I think, are helpful in that perspective. The conservative policy that they're proposed with, like the new hiring grant, I think is really interesting from that perspective, because it effectively allows you to increase wages without really increasing wages from a business point of view. Because that's, you know, as we think about the challenge going forward, and as I said, I'm sure almost everybody in the call has been dealing with this one way or another. Like, the labor shortages are real and they're serious, and what they are, in fact, is limiting our ability to grow now and probably for the next several quarters, just because, you know, business could be fantastic, but you got to be able to capitalize on it, right?
Well, I talked to, I'm sure you hear this too, to some of my friends and our members who are in restaurant, and saying they believe it's probably 18 months off before they're really fully up. And they also point out, we can't ever make up you can't make up for the time that you do. It's not like you can, you know, we'll put on an extra shift, and if people aren't coming at 3 a.m. to go for wings at the sports.
Yeah, you're not going to have like 12 coffees a day to make up for the 2 years where you didn't go, right?
That you miss. So there's an element of, it'll take a long time. And I think the other part is, talent issues is one thing, but even if they had the talent, the demand side still isn't there fully to, you know, to even have the folks on. Like, they wouldn't open up, even if they could open up, in some cases more fully, they may not want to, because the demand's not there. And I think that gets lost in the discussion around talent. I want to talk a little bit about the role of attracting and retaining talent. We just started touching on that. You know, what's Scotia's view, or your view of how to advance or to deal with this issue as the economy does start to ramp up? I mean, I think of things like, and you talked a little bit about it, and this may be part of it, the role of immigration is huge, and we are in the Waterloo region, I think we're the 4th or 5th final spot where people will take up residence. We are a community of immigrants, newcomers here. On that new employment, according to, and I belong to chair the working group of the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region. So seeing newcomers and the importance of them and matching them with the jobs that are available is an incredibly important part of our region here. All that new employment is likely to come from immigration. If not here already, it's pretty close. That immigration, the reason we're having those types of numbers is we simply need the people in our workforce. So I guess, you know, for us, that's one of those issues that will help drive that. But when you talk about the talent gaps or the shortages, what's Scotia's view of the recipe to try and address that?
Well, obviously, the more skilled labor you've got, the better, right? And whether that's immigration, whether that's retraining, whether that's on the job training, like all that stuff is really, really important. But I guess one of the lessons I think from the pandemic is that workers are more flexible in terms of where they want to work than we thought they were pre-pandemic, right? So if given the opportunity, you set them up with technology and their jobs that they can do from basically wherever they want, employers letting folks do that has led to very significant moves of populations away from various places into various places. So Kitchener-Waterloo certainly benefited from that. The interior BC benefited from that. Vancouver Island benefited from that. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, like you've seen this ease with which people can basically do types of jobs which you thought needed to be in a specific area much more easily. So that means that one of the factors driving employment choices on the part of workers is, I want to live in a nice place. I want to live in a place where I can afford a house, or I got a pool, or I don't have to spend an hour and a half in my car to get to work, or there aren't 10 million people around me. And that is, and we certainly have seen that over the last 18 months, and that has been an important driver, in fact, of the real estate strength that we're seeing in all these kind of outlying Sudbury. People moving to Sudbury that used to work in Toronto. And that, I think, is employers are starting to realize that there's this potential, because it's interesting, is that not only you can allow folks to work from wherever they want, and of course that reduces your footprint and makes it more cost effective to some extent, but it can lead to employers think about where they locate very differently than where they did in the past, right? If there's no cost to being 3.5 hours outside of Toronto from an ability to attract staff perspective, then why don't you go 3.5 hours outside of Toronto? So that's happening. So that's what I meant when so if you're in a community where you've got the ability to say build a ton of housing, reduce the cost of living relative to other places. It's nice. You got rivers, you got nature, you got all kinds of things that decent weather, you got all kinds of things that can draw people to you. Like, that's a huge advantage now that you can capitalize on much more easily than you could before. Now, Waterloo's always kind of been privileged because of the clusters you've got there. But it is, and it's partly why prices have been rising extremely rapidly in your area as well. But that is the reality that we're now in, that workers are just, they're like, I've experienced the last 18 months. I prioritize quality of life maybe over professional ambition at this point, and I'm very happy to spend a couple of years, working out of my lakeside house, rather than being in a downtown Toronto condo.
Well, one of the comments in the chat box from our friend Dan at Applyboard is that it's across sectors. I mean, it's certainly in the innovation space that they're having some of the, and they have the ability, and some of the companies in that space, which you're aware of, have said they're working totally remote, or that and others are doing the complete opposite, which is must be in space. So there's going to be, I think, in every sector and every company is going to have its own view of what these things look like. Let's pivot a little bit too, because that digital economy you talked about for just about for every sector is really important. Like, how we connect with one another. Manufacturing is still one in 5 jobs, and close to 1 in 5, or 20% of the local economy here, if you include supply chain and food processing. So, but it's a huge part of this economy, and I think people forget that. It's tremendous that we have folks like Scotia, and that you have a very significant regional bank here, the accounting firms, law firms, universities, college, the tech space. But manufacturing is still the number one employer. So how over the last 18 months has the space performed, all things considered, here in Waterloo Region? And how do they, I mean, there's got to be parts of that manufacturing space where the talent piece, which is some of them, whether you're an engineer, whether you're, there are some parts of manufacturing that can be done remotely to address some of those talent issues. But you also have, if you're making stuff, you got to have people online. You got to have people there. Maybe just, trying to weave together how the manufacturing space is doing. What are some of those changes and what you see moving forward?
Yeah, so manufacturing across the country has been doing remarkably well. I mean, the auto sector has obviously been impacted by the chip shortage, and that's got some spillover effects for the parts and the industry. But I mean, that should be a reasonably temporary thing. In fact, when you think about the auto sector, it's very, very clear that there's a tremendous amount of pent-up demand. So as soon as kind of those chips are brought into the country, you're going to see a dramatic acceleration of production. So there's a bit of a temporary drag on the manufacturing side associated with that. But even then, when you set aside the auto industry and you look at manufacturing employment in Canada, it's above where it was pre-pandemic now. So this is one of these industries that has rebounded pretty rapidly. And that's all kinds of manufacturing. It's just not just cars and sheet metal. It's advanced manufacturing. It's biopharmaceuticals. There's a range of things that fit under the manufacturing umbrella that are all generally doing very, very well. And again, they are facing an acute challenge on the labor side. So it's not just like skilled labor. It's not just engineers, as you said, or accountants, or it's folks to get on a plant and like put some stuff together. And whether that's really advanced stuff or just working on an auto plant and handling a robot that's welding things together. And so like it's part and parcel of how most sectors are evolving right now. Now I would have thought, and this is a bit of a mystery to me, I would have thought that a lot of the workers in the food and accommodation world, which are deciding to leave the industry for whatever reason, if they're in the reasonably unskilled camp, and a lot of them are, that manufacturing would be a welcome place for them. But that transition doesn't seem to be occurring as much as I thought it would. So I thought, the perils or the hardships of the food and accommodation world would be the benefit of the manufacturing world. I'm sure some of that is happening, but it's not happening to an extent that is, really making it much more easy for those firms to hire folks relative to, say, 18 months ago. Perhaps it's just a matter of time, but and again, maybe wages changed.
Yeah.
Maybe what you need is just you need far higher wages to encourage people to come back, and which isn't very healthy, but maybe that's what all this is telling us.
So that may be some pockets in order to kind of stimulate that, and then things will even out. And I guess that's one of the themes is the closures have been or the closing of the economy during the lockdowns was uneven. The reopening has been uneven, and who is in what shape is uneven. And I guess it's one thing that's concerning to businesses. What government's not good at is being targeted and specific to help the areas that it needs to. That's not really a criticism. That's just a reality of having a big institution and trying to be targeted. As I spent my little corner of the world 7 years on city council prior to Mayor Jaworski. It's awful hard to get targeted with bylaws, let alone when you're dealing with macroeconomic, financing or trying to drive labor.
Targeted or timely, right?
Yeah, and time's a whole nother matter. Listen, we got about 10 minutes or slightly less than that, so I got a few more questions, and we can kind of maybe do these in rapid fire. I mean, both the Ontario and federal government's budgets in 2021 I'll turn my phone off there. Had lots of money and have been for many years on infrastructure spending. Do you think that they're realistic? I mean, one of the issues, and this comes back a little bit to talent, like even if you want to do some of the projects, is there enough talent across the country to do them? But are the not only the budgets for infrastructure realistic? Did they meet the needs of the country in terms of that core infrastructure and the social infrastructure that's required as we think about a new economy, the new sort of digital economy. I mean, are we on the right track, and are we spending the right amount on the right things? What's the Scotiabank view of infrastructure, both provincially and federally?
I think big picture, we're not spending nearly enough on infrastructure of all kinds, whether it's, facilitating goods getting to market, or the energy grid, or I mean, you name it, the school system, the health system, like it's all the long-term care, like those are all parts of infrastructure, social or otherwise, which and some parts obviously were observed to be clearly underfunded and during the pandemic in particular. But I guess the real issue on the infrastructure side is, I mean, there are a couple, as you pointed out, but governments have all these plans on the infrastructure side, and they always take like a million times longer than they're supposed to, right? So I mean, the federal government set up the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and hasn't done anything yet. It's been like 2-3 years, and they've got these big infrastructure plans at the federal and provincial level. They're constantly lapsing money because they can't get it out the door fast enough. They can't figure out which projects to finance. They can't get the resources, like the labor or the materials, to advance on time. So there's a question of, are we doing the right stuff? And I'd say, we're doing some of the right stuff, but mostly we're just not
fast enough.
We're just not doing enough of anything, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes particularly important, say, to a region like yours, or regions that are kind of outlying major centers as well. I mean, the transportation infrastructure is like, it just sucks. I mean, there's no better way to put it. And in particular, like the public transportation aspect. So if you're thinking about greening the economy, the rail network's kind of lame. Nothing really goes fast. It's not like if you go to a European city or an Asian city and it's just like things are well organized, right? It's not here. So there are these low-lying things that can just get, like, if you're willing to do them, if you can clear, local political blockages, then we'd be in a much, much better spot.
Yeah. Well, I think we can encapsulate that by saying I was on city council in 2003 when we started talking about all-day two-way GO service, and we just got the announcement in spring of 2021. So not that I just put that in reference, that a lot of those things would have been talked about for a long time. So speed is not a virtue, especially when, as you say, the need is so great, and moving goods and service and people, both for pleasure and for business, is incredibly important. You've highlighted a good one. Okay, 2 quick questions, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up. We could go on for all afternoon, but I know you've got a busy afternoon, and we appreciate your time. And I guess it's really more of a question of, in the past, there would always be a discussion around election platforms and deficits and debt, and it's almost like it doesn't exist anymore. No one really is. It's not a high priority for many, and maybe for some, but not for many. The parties have not made it say, it's been costed. Here's what we're thinking. Here's where we're going to come into balance. There's some vague, I would even say the Conservatives may have said, 10 years that they can come into balance, but it's really hasn't been really driven. I'm not even sure the Liberals have a plan. I think the other parties don't even think it's an issue. And I guess I just wonder from purely economic, from an economist perspective, it absolutely will matter at some point. The question is when. What's your sense of that? I mean, I remember I did an event with Prime Minister Harper at some point, 4 or 5 years, or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe, and asked the question of saying deficits and debt are tomorrow's tax increases at some point, because you cannot, there's going to be some issues there. And I guess that's the concern of businesses. If we keep having these huge deficits and debt, at some point somebody's going to have to pay the bill. Maybe that's the question. What's your sense of what that's looks like right now?
Yeah, I think we're on a path now where that's not necessary. That, obviously deficits, debt like skyrocketed through the pandemic. There's no question about it. We started the pandemic with federal debt at 30% of GDP, and it's about 50% now. So that's almost a doubling in like 24 months, 20 months. It's by far the most rapid degradation of public finances in our history. But it's important to keep in mind that it's only 50%. In fact, when you think of it from a G7 perspective, at 50, when 30 we were the lowest, at 50 we're still the lowest, and we're going to be the lowest for a long time. So the level actually isn't all that high. And a lot of the programs that kind of led us to increase debt so fast are like, they're going to get unwound. I mean, they are being unwound, and they will be unwound when the pandemic's over. So when you kind of take that into consideration, take future growth into consideration, even take the parties' platforms into consideration, we end up in a situation where the debt ratio, so debt to GDP, falls gradually over time without requiring any tax increases, assuming no crazy program spending either. And that's really kind of where we take comfort from that. Is it looks like we can do this without requiring any additional taxes. Now, governments may do that. The Liberals may raise taxes. The NDP would raise taxes, but they would do that in the context of some inequality. No, I think it'd be focused on inequality. Like, we're raising taxes on the rich to pay for this program for the poor, that kind of thing, but not because they need to do it from a fiscal sustainability perspective.
Okay, last question, and this is more for someone that at some point, if the US ever gets its act together, might want to go back to somewhere warm in the wintertime. So the Canadian dollar is I guess it's a perpetual question. Any chance that it ever gets back close to parity, and what does it mean even if it does? I mean, or does it really matter from an economic perspective?
It wouldn't matter from an economic perspective. I think the chances are close to zero, because when you think about it, what drives currencies over the long run, it's largely driven by an economy's productive capacity, and so competitiveness. So if we do end up in a spot where the market has pushed us to a dollar on a sustained basis, it's probably happening because we somehow miraculously became way more competitive relative to the US and we're super productive, in which case, like, that'd be awesome for us. So if we do end up in a dollar world, like a parity world in a few years, I would take that as an extremely good outcome, because it means something's happened underneath with all that to generate that outcome.
Okay, good to know. I was just thinking about it as the poor guy going to try and take two kids.
It makes it easier to go to Florida. Yeah,
it makes it easier to go to Florida. But I think it's important. Listen, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, JF, for taking the time to do this with us today. To Sean Goddard and James, we look forward to working closely with Scotia as always. This has been very helpful, because I think sometimes as we get towards, at least we can see the light at the end of the tunnel as it relates to COVID. We're still got some challenging days ahead for business and for local leaders and leaders at all levels. But I think we do see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's important for us to be thinking about what's next and how we prepare ourselves for what comes after the pandemic. But the reopening is, it's herky-jerky, and it's sector by sector. So the recovery is the same as well. And please know that to those listening, that the chamber is here. We work together with the Business Economic Support Team to make sure we're carrying those messages to decision makers around what's important to business. So once again, JF, thanks so much for taking the time. Great. We'd love to have you back in
anytime.
We have lots of opportunities to bring you back, and you're a great speaker. So thank you for taking the time today. And with that, I'll pass it back to Adam Smith to close out today's event.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Jean-Francois Perot. Fascinating discussion. I think that I was happy to see all the discussion happening in the chat box there. So fascinating all around. Thank you. Also, thanks to the entire Scotiabank team for your support with today's event and for sharing those insights with us. We will now be opening the couple of smaller breakout rooms for networking. They will be automatically assigned, and you will receive a notification momentarily. We thank you for attending today's annual general meeting and hope to see you at another upcoming virtual event very soon. Thanks, everyone.